When Palpatine took over the Republic and turned it into the first galactic empire,
Galactic Empire!
he traded out clones who were the strongest army in the galaxy, and they were a pre-made army, and he switched them for stormtroopers. And do I really have to tell you how bad stormtroopers are? I mean, stormtroopers were the most elite soldiers in the galaxy, but in the movies they were not that. So why on earth did Palpatine do that? I'm going to explain that on today's episode of Star Wars, Nerds and Geeks. Most people think that the reason Palpatine switched out clones for stormtroopers is because of expenses. It's because clones were really, really expensive, and they were. Clones were way too expensive for a galaxy that wasn't at war. But I don't think that's right. Most people think that because it says that in the movies, in the Bad Batch, they say that directly, that they were getting rid of the clones because clones are too expensive. However, I don't think that's the real reason. I think that's just the reason that they told people. I think that there are actually other more significant reasons. The reason that I say it's not because of cost is because Palpatine had so much money. I mean, look at it. He created 2 Death Stars, each of which had to cost like trillions of credits. So obviously money was not a big deal for him. And maybe he needed to save the money to build those Death Stars, but again, I don't think that's the reason. See, Palpatine had 2 things going for him in the way of the clones. Number 1, he controlled the banks. We see in the Clone Wars Season 6 that Palpatine ends up getting control of the banks, so money's not that big of a deal. Sure, controlling the banks doesn't mean he gets free money, but it does mean that he controls the money, so therefore, Palpatine doesn't really have to worry about money that much. And then second off, Palpatine controls Kamino. So while that doesn't mean that he can get clones for free, that does mean that Palpatine can get clones for as cheap as possible. So if Palpatine has pretty much control of the money in the galaxy, and he is able to get clones for extremely cheap, I don't think that money is the problem at all. I think that there is a much bigger reason for switching out the clones for stormtroopers. The reason is inadvertently because of the Jedi. See, the Jedi inspired the clones to be individualistic, while the Kaminoans wanted the clones to just act like droids, act as one single unit. The Jedi told the clones that they had to be individuals. They were each a separate person, unique in the Force, and so every single clone got their own identity, their own personality, and that was the whole point of the Clone Wars TV show, as we get to see the clones as they all have their own personalities and unique characteristics and traits, and that's what makes the Clone Wars so awesome. But that also is what makes the clones a liability to Palpatine. This makes clones extraordinarily dangerous because they can all think for themselves. They aren't droids. They are human beings, and they have personalities, and they have traits, and they're individualistic. So Palpatine is scared of that because these clones, they have their own free mind, so they can turn against him at any point. This is proved time and time again in the Clone Wars and in the Bad Batch, because in both of these shows, we see that the only reason that clones were turning on the Jedi and serving Palpatine is because of the inhibitor chips in their head. So once a clone had the inhibitor chip removed from their head, they immediately turned against Palpatine every single time. That's a major liability on Palpatine's fault. If every single soldier in your army is only in your army because you're forcing them to be, well then the second you aren't forcing them to be, the second the chip is out of their head, they're going to turn against you. So if somebody gets together and realizes that they can take out the chip of every single soldier, then Palpatine's entire army would turn against him. And that's something that Palpatine cannot allow. Palpatine realizes that he can't have soldiers following him because he's forcing them to be. Because eventually, if you're forcing somebody to do something, when they break free, they will turn against you. So therefore, he needs a group of soldiers that will come to him willingly, that out of their own free will are choosing to serve the Empire. And if he does this, then that means that those soldiers will stay because they're joining the Empire because they believe that it's the right thing to do. And if he has soldiers that are loyal to him in this way, then they will be on his side and they won't turn against him, but they'll also fight stronger and harder because they're fighting for something that they believe in, not something they're forced to believe in. But that's not the only reason. Sure, it's worrisome to have every single clone be able to turn against you if the chip's taken out of their head, but admittedly, it's a really difficult procedure. At least it takes time to take the chip out of a soldier's head. You have to get each of them into their own medical bay and take it out one by one. It's a very long process, and it'd be very hard to do it across an entire army. However, I don't think that the only reason that Palpatine got rid of the clones was because the inhibitor chip could be taken out of their heads. I think that the clones were actually able to defy the inhibitor chip. I think that the clones, given time, would have broken free of the inhibitor chip, regardless of whether it was inside their heads or not. So I think that Palpatine realized that given enough time, all his soldiers will eventually turn against him. And so that's why he switched them out. And I do have proof for this, I promise. I first saw this in the ending of the Season 7 Clone Wars, where Captain Rex had the inhibitor chip out of his head and he was helping Ahsoka escape the Jedi cruiser, and Jesse was stopping them. And in this scene, we see Jesse hesitate. He doesn't want to shoot. It's like half of him knows that he shouldn't shoot and he's trying to stop himself, but the inhibitor chip is forcing him to try and shoot them. The inhibitor chip is forcing him to say that they are traitors. The inhibitor chip is forcing him to do all that. So while the inhibitor chip is making him do all this stuff, yes, but as you watch it, you can see Jesse try to fight against it. And so that means that Jesse wasn't doing this out of his own free will. Jesse was being forced to do this, which is something that we can all assume. However, it also means that clones have the potential to break away from Order 66, break away from the inhibitor chip, and become out of their own free will again. And if Jesse, only a couple hours after Order 66 is being called, if Jesse's able to break free of it, or is at least attempting to break free of it, only hours after Order 66 was called, then obviously it can be broken quite easily. It's not something that is very hard to break. And sure, Jesse and Rex, they all had emotional connections to Ahsoka, so that made it easier for them. But eventually, this means that all clones will be able to turn against Palpatine, that they will all be able to get rid of Order 66, the inhibitor chip, just completely ignore it and be able to get their own free will. And then more proof for this is when I got my idea for this, when I saw the newest Bad Batch episode. I think it's called Devil's Deal. When I saw that episode, I realized that clones were breaking free of the inhibitor chip. Most clones in that episode were acting like all the clones in the Bad Batch, like they were under the control of Order 66, and that they were just doing what Palpatine told them to do without any free will. However, if you see the clone commander or lieutenant or whatever he is, and I don't remember his name, so I'll put it on screen, but if you see him throughout the episode, constantly, he's acting under his own free will. He's not acting under Order 66, under his own free will. And he's resisting Order 66. He's resisting the inhibitor chip. He's doing the things that he wants to do. And the inhibitor chip is trying to force him to do some things. And sometimes he'll have to listen to it, but sometimes he's able to break free of it. So that is the proof that I have that the inhibitor chip can be broken out of. Given enough time, given enough persistence, all the clones will be able to break free of the inhibitor chip. And so because of that, Palpatine needed to get rid of the clones. They were all a liability. At any given moment, the clones could turn against him and kill him. And so, Palpatine needed a better solution. Palpatine ended up creating the stormtrooper army, because the stormtroopers are made up of civilians who all chose to fight for Palpatine. They weren't forced to fight for Palpatine, they chose to fight for Palpatine. And because the stormtroopers chose to fight for Palpatine, they all believed in the cause, and they all would stand by his side. And so therefore, the clone army was out because they did not choose to be there. And the stormtrooper army was in because the stormtroopers chose to be there, and so they would fight harder, fight stronger, and fight more loyal. The interesting thing about this is that Palpatine had to get rid of a very, very strong army because he couldn't trust them anymore and replace them with an army that was still strong but was much weaker. So, while it may have been the right call, it definitely wasn't a good call. But what do you think of this? Do you think Palpatine made the right choice, or do you think he could have done something to keep the clones? Tell me that in the comments, please. And this is Star Wars Nerds and Geeks signing off. See you all next time.